So we're here this evening to talk from various perspectives about the Japanese fiction writer, Akutagawa Ryūnosuke. And we have two people coming at it from different angles. So first of all, David Peace is the author of a number of books, and in particular a number of books about Japan. And we're going to be talking particularly about this one, which is his latest one to come out, Patient X. And obviously he'll explain about it, but or between the two of them they'll explain about it, but it's a sort of reimagining of Akutagawa's life through his works. I have to admit, I don't know Akutagawa's entire works, so every now and again I would get a sort of flash of recognition when I came across something that I did know, so I'm wondering what else I missed, but no doubt I'll find out. So anyway, David's, I don't need to go through all of his other books, but a number of them have also been made into either TV films or indeed sort of big screen films. So in particular, The Damned United was made into a film. And he moved back to Tokyo a few years ago, and as well as writing there, he also teaches contemporary English literature at the University of Tokyo. 21st century literature, isn't it? I remember we had this conversation a few years ago, and I said there can't be much yet, and he proved me wrong. Reeling off huge lists of authors. And then Damien Flanagan has spoken here several times before. He's an expert on Japanese contemporary, 20th century literature primarily. He got a PhD writing his thesis in Japanese at Kobe University, and he's published books in both Japanese and English, particularly about the authors Soseki and Mishima. So Nihonjin no Shiranai Soseki is one of them that rings a bell. So the Soseki that even Japanese people don't know about, he published in Japanese. And he still lives partly in Japan, I think, in or around Kobe. So I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work between the two of them, but I'm sure it'll work very well. So off you go.
Great. I think I might stand here, give it a bit of presence. I was just going to speak for about 10-15 minutes, tell you a little bit about Akutagawa, and then I'm going to pass over to David, who's going to give us some readings from his novel about Akutagawa, Patient X. It's great, of course, to be back here at the Daiwa Foundation. We gave here last year 2 talks on James Bond and calligraphy. So I really feel we're going great range here, talking here tonight about the great short story writer Ryūnosuke Akutagawa. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japan went through an extraordinary literary renaissance. Japan had always had strong literary traditions, from magnificent Heian novels and diaries to medieval no and kabuki plays, from ghost tales to poetry in diverse forms. But in the late 19th century, when Japan came into contact with the West, a radical transformation occurs. In an incredibly compressed period of time, Japan absorbs not just all the unknown literature of the world flooding in from America, Europe and beyond, but all the political theories, fine artworks, philosophy, psychology, sexology, sociology and science. There's a tremendous stimulus to the creation of new ways of seeing the world. But more than that, literature suddenly emerges as something profoundly necessary for Japan to modernize, to resist colonialization and establish itself on the world stage. Literature is suddenly a matter of intense national pride and renewal, the direct means of comprehending and ordering the world itself. Already by the 1890s, literary masters like Kuro Rohan, Ozaki Koyo and Kyoka Izumi had created highly technically sophisticated literary works, and they were soon followed by young female prodigies like Ichio Higuchi and the poet Akiko Yasuno. By 1905, we reached the high renaissance of the literary boom, with supreme literary talents, perhaps never surpassed, of Natsume Soseki and Moriogai. And in the 1910s and 20s, there was wave upon wave of major new writers, Junichiro Tanizaki, Yasunari Kawabata, Edogawa Rampo, Shiga Naoya, Takeo Arishima, Torson Shimazaki, and many, many others. When Lu Xun, the future great writer of China, arrived in Japan in 1902 to study medicine, he breathed in the new ether, and soon he too had converted to the new religion of literature, abandoning medicine and declaring what a nation truly needed was literature, literature, literature. It's right in the midst of this period of unprecedented literary tumult that a young man, Ryūnosuke Akutagawa, comes to the fore and begins to write. The literary renaissance in Japan was both his blessing and his curse. Blessing because he is surrounded by extraordinarily talented literary figures who inspire him. Ryūnosuke was born in 1892 and studied English literature at Tokyo Imperial University from 1913. This was a period when virtually all the great writers of Japan attended the same ultra-prestigious university, Tokyo University, and they often all knew each other and went on to become members of the Bundan, the elite literary world. Ryūnosuke is writing stories like his early comic piece, The Nose, even while still a student, and they begin to attract the attention of the dominant literary figure of the age, Natsume Soseki, who for a period in 1916 becomes a mentor to Ryūnosuke, encouraging him to go on and establish himself by writing 20 or 30 such stories. Ryūnosuke would go on to write 150 stories, many set in a historical past inspired by his reading of the Japanese classics but infused by Japanese sensibilities. He's a literary prodigy. But the literary renaissance, pushing literature in a pressure cooker environment of creativity and competition to ever greater heights, was also a curse. Imagine if you were surrounded by literary geniuses, all reading voraciously the same books as you, works by Nietzsche, Edgar Allan Poe, and William James, for example, and all utterly hell-bent on literary success. Soseki had seen the danger and advised the young Akutagawa to live not like a horse, racing against the others, but like an ox, resolutely making its own way. But Soseki was a fine one to talk. He himself was utterly obsessed with literature, telling his new wife on the night they got married that she shouldn't expect him to spend much time on her because he had books to read. He lived himself like a racing horse, and he was utterly worn out and finished at age 49. Now it was the turn of Ryūnosuke Akutagawa to utterly engross himself in literature, to eat, sleep, and breathe literature to the point that you couldn't think about anything else. Tellingly, Ryūnosuke wrote stories like Hellscream, where a medieval artist is prepared to burn his own daughter just so he can capture her pain in an artistic work. This is a brutal, risk everything, give everything, hold nothing back literary game we are embarked upon. Akutagawa travelled to Nagasaki and investigated Japan's Christian history, and getting a job with the Osaka Mainichi paper, he crossed to China and travelled around Shanghai, Nanjing, and southeastern China for a few months, but always his mind was directed to the intense literary struggle and competition back home. Already subject to a delicate mental state, his mother had suffered from full-blown mental disorders. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, devastating in its destruction of Tokyo, removed further Akutagawa's sense of solidity and trust in the world about him, as if the ground might open up beneath him and swallow him at any time. In the years after the earthquake, he wrote pieces filled with a strange unease, describing mirages he suffered from hallucinations and gear mechanisms we cannot see. One of his final stories is his most loved, The Tale of the Water Sprite Kappa, a Swiftian satire on humanity. Akutagawa, who had by this stage a wife and 3 children, tragically killed himself by overdose in 1927 at the age of 35. He in fact committed suicide on the birthday of one of his great literary rivals, Junichiro Tanizaki, with whom he had been in fierce debate, arguing over the supremacy of structure against style. In 1935, 8 years after his death, Akutagawa's close friend, the dramatist Kan Kikuchi, inaugurated a literary prize in his memory. And today in Japan, the Akutagawa Prize is the most fiercely sought-after award amongst aspiring young talents. Winning the prize means that the door to the entire literary world has been opened to you. There is, of course, a supreme irony that the young writer who had once been advised not to live like a racing horse has now become synonymous with the most hotly contested literary horse race in Japan. For the rest of the world, however, it was the appearance in 1950 of Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon, based on two of Akutagawa's stories, that took the name Akutagawa global. The story Rashomon, about a servant encountering an old woman stealing from the bodies of the dead inside the derelict gate at the southern entrance to Kyoto, provides a frame for the film. The more central story, In a Grove, describes multiple mutually contradictory accounts of the same murder incident. The film began a process of transmission, transformation, and indeed sometimes distortion of Akutagawa, which continues to this day. In fact, the very term Rashomon effect, describing the confusingly subjective accounts of the same incident, represents the mismatch of the context of In a Grove, written in 1922, with the title of the completely different story, Rashomon, written in 1915. It was the success of the film which meant that at college, the first piece of Japanese I read in class was Akutagawa's story, In a Grove, and the power of the film has been long-lasting. We live today in our super woke society where every ethnicity, gender, sexuality is hopefully represented. But I'd like to tell you a little story about the recent re-emergence of Akutagawa's stories in English. 20 years ago, I wrote to Penguin Classics suggesting that with the millennium coming up, wouldn't it be a good idea if they thought about having the leading modern writer of Japan, Natsume Soseki, and China, Lu Xun, in their World Classics series? I mean, Japan and China are quite important in the world, aren't they? They took a little bit of interest in the idea and asked me if I could send them any of Soseki's novels, as they couldn't find any themselves. But eventually they said they would have to leave it for now, as they were busy putting George Gissing into their World Classics at the time. A few years later, I'd done a book in English about Soseki in Britain, and I decided to give them another prod and wrote to them again. This time they were more interested, but finally concluded if they did do Soseki, they would have to start with the major novels. They were trying to think about how do you introduce great East Asian writers to a British public unfamiliar with them, a subject I'd like to discuss more with David in a moment. But their conclusion was, and this gives you a little insight into how major publishers go about things, that they should start not with Soseki or Lu Xun, but with Ryūnosuke Akutagawa, because after all, so many people were familiar with the Kurosawa film Rashomon. And further, they decided to get the currently hugely popular Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami to introduce the stories, hopefully bringing his mass readership with him. And so, in 2006, the book Rashomon and 17 Other Stories was launched in Penguin Classics. And I have to tell you, I was rather rolling my eyes at the time, and positively laughed when I read in Murakami's introduction that he personally rated modern Japanese authors in this order. 1, Soseki, 2, Tanizaki, and 3, some distance behind, Akutagawa. I told you that, I wanted to scream. But the irony also struck me of the horse race. Soseki, who had told Akutagawa not to be a racing horse, had been apprised first in the literary race by Murakami. It was Akutagawa's great nemesis, Tanizaki, who had run in second. Yet it was ironically third-place Akutagawa who had won the all-important race to break into world classics first. I'd like to discuss with David in more detail in just a second both ways interest in Akutagawa comes from, how he tackled the question of transmitting Akutagawa to a Western audience, and to return to that burning question of literary rivalries. But first, David is, I think, going to read for us a section of his novels which describes just how intense was the merging of Akutagawa with the characters in his own literary world, such that the barriers between fact and fiction begin to break down, and Akutagawa begins to see in his own literary creations and his literary rivals his own doppelganger, or double.
Thank you. Sterling introduction to Akutagawa. I just would take this opportunity to thank the Daiwa Anglo Foundation for hosting this event, and to thank you all for coming tonight. This is a a section from the novel Patient X. In his room in the lodging house in Yokosuka, Ryūnosuke threw down his pen and cursed. He had planned to write a story in a single sitting that night, planned because he had no choice if he was to meet the deadline. But it was already gone midnight, and all he had scribbled was a dismal, ramshackle chain of words with neither beauty nor point. He lit another cigarette. His mind wandered, searching for targets to blame for his inability to write the story. If only he did not have to teach in the morning, then he could write through the night. But not only had he lessons to teach, there were always so many other demands and requests between the classes. A funeral oration for some captain or other, a revision of a lecture in English for a colleague, a translation of an article for a foreign newspaper, and how could he forget the textbook he was supposed to be putting together? There was also an ever-rising pile of letters from friends and editors which he needed to answer, and then there was his wedding, the endless appointments, discussions and formalities. He cursed again, then cursed himself. Blaming others would solve nothing. He put out his cigarette, he picked up his pen, tried to get it moving again, but still he could not write a single line of worth. He put down his pen again. He needed help, he needed inspiration, and not another cigarette. He picked up a book from a desk, he got up from the desk, he walked over to the bedding already laid out on the floor. He stretched out on the futon to read the book. The book was a collection of stories by Edgar Allan Poe. He began to reread one of the stories, attentive more than ever to the inspiration behind the work, the way in which Poe had adapted his original source. This particular story was based on a brief article by Washington Irving. Ryūnosuke was familiar with that article. He recalled the protagonist was a young man who finds himself followed and thwarted at every turn by a masked figure. Finally, the young man stabs the figure with his sword, but when the young man looks behind the mask, he finds only his own image, the spectre of himself. Ryūnosuke had even copied out that line by Irving into one of his own notebooks, along with so many other lines and passages from Poe. But now, as he reread Poe's retelling, he began to feel ill. In all of Poe's tales, Ryūnosuke felt the fragility of a mind so easily fragmented and torn, shattered and ripped into so many pieces. And yet Poe wrote with such craftsmanship, with such clarity and with such realism, yet with such lyricism. The alchemy of his analytical intellect and his poetic temperament, harnessing and sculpting the truth. The dreams within his dreams, real and yet unreal, in words, in writing, in poetry and prose, tales and stories so beautiful and so terrifying and so much greater greater than Ryūnosuke could ever hope to even attempt. He hurled the book into the corner of a room. You have conquered, and I yield. Ryūnosuke collapsed back onto the bedding. He stared up at the ceiling, his night thoughts reading patterns and signs in the shadows and the stains, and he closed his eyes. Ryūnosuke was sitting in a box seat at the theatre. A woman by his side, a woman he did not recognise. In the darkness she was squeezing his arm, resting her cheek on his shoulder. On the screen an old man in a top hat tore up a sheet of paper, scattered the pieces over the body of a young man lying dead on the floor. The scene then changed, the double of the young man sitting on his grave under a willow tree. Beside Ryūnosuke, the woman was squeezing his arm tighter and tighter, the warmth of her blood burning through her clothes and into his, her mouth to his ear, whispering, "Where you go, I'll always be, even to the last of your days. Look, look." Now Ryūnosuke saw himself up on the screen, in a garden which looked like the garden of his family home in Tabata. Ryūnosuke was sitting on the steps to the veranda. He was wearing a large brimmed sun hat, smoking a cigarette, blowing smoke directly into the camera. He seemed much older, his face gaunt, his hair long beneath the hat. 2 children, 2 boys, were playing around him in the garden. They seemed to be his children, his sons. Suddenly this Ryūnosuke sprang up and started to climb the large crepe myrtle tree beside the veranda. Higher and higher he climbed, his underwear visible, swinging from branch to branch, until he reached the eaves of a house. He climbed out onto a limb and perched there, staring out at the audience. A caption flashed up on the screen. "Quack, quack, pleased to meet you. I'm a Kappa. My name is Tok." The children ran screaming into the house, this house which looked like a family home. Ryūnosuke followed them inside the house. The children disappeared down a corridor. Ryūnosuke followed after them but lost them. Still searching for them, he turned into a room. A man in a Chinese patterned yukata was lying on a futon on the floor, his eyes closed, a holy Bible open on his chest. The man looked like Ryūnosuke, his exact double. Now the eldest child came into the room. He shook the man, he woke the man. The man sat up and the man said, "I've been having such an odd dream. I dreamt we were playing in the garden, but you and your brother ran into the house. I followed you, but I lost you, and when I came into this house, I saw myself lying senseless, lifeless on the floor, like an old discarded raincoat." Ryūnosuke could not contain himself. He cried out to the man on the bed, "I came searching for you, and here you are." The man rose from the futon, came to Ryūnosuke and embraced him. "So you are Ryūnosuke too? It was not a dream." "No," cried Ryūnosuke, "it was more true than truth itself." But hardly had Ryūnosuke finished speaking when a younger child came to the door, looked inside, then turned and ran, crying, "Mama, Mama, please come to Ri-chan's room at once." Now the man rushed into the room as Ryūnosuke called after him, "Please don't go, Ryūnosuke, please don't leave me." The older boy looked at Ryūnosuke, stared at him and laughed. "Where is this Ryūnosuke you were calling to, Ryū-chan?" Ryūnosuke pointed at the door. "He has just gone out." "Why, you are still dreaming," said the boy. "Don't you know who you are talking to? It's your own reflection in the mirror." Suddenly the film jumped, appeared to snap in two, the lights in the theatre went up. The woman beside Ryūnosuke dug her nails into his arm, bit his ear and said, "So this is how it ends."
Thanks, David. So I'm going to raise a variety of topics and discuss them with David, and then I'll be opening it up to the floor. So please build up your most difficult questions and then ask them to David, not me. David, the obvious question, how did you become interested in Akutagawa?
Well, I moved to Tokyo in 1994, and I moved from Istanbul, and I didn't really come to Japan with any particular deep-seated desire for Japanese culture. It was well, that's a too long story to go into. So to stick into Akutagawa, early on I wanted. I wanted to know as much about the city that I'd moved to Tokyo on the country, and I think for me fiction's always been a way to learn about a place and a time. And I went to Kinokuni books, the old Kinokuni books in Shinjuku, and I actually went looking for a Murakami book, actually, I think it was Wild Sheep Chase, and I found it there, but at the same time there was this very lurid looking, like small book called, it said Rashomon, and it had a picture of a kind of samurai figure ripping open a lady's kimono. And I still have the book. I remember this clearly because the cover was so awful. I don't say this as like a retro political correctness. It was so awful that I really wasn't sure I wanted this book in my house. Right? But I think the reason I went for this book, Rashomon, was because of, as you were saying, about the film. Because I'd seen, I don't know if people might remember this, in the 80s at some point, I think Alex Cox did a double bill of Rashomon, and Rashomon was remade as a Western, The Outrage, and so I think it was a recognition of the Rashomon name, but I don't remember being conscious at the time of watching the film that Akutagawa was the author of the stories. But I picked up the book in Kinokuni and I looked, forgetting the cover, looked, the introduction sounded fascinating, and it was particularly in a grove. I thought that in a grove, and I still think that there were precedents, Ambrose Bierce, and there are precedents for the idea of different narrative accounts of the same incident, but in a grove is very, very different, and I think it's considering it was written in 1922. The idea that you don't reconcile the narrative voices as they don't, and that there's no reconciliation. So I thought this was incredible, and much later on, it was the inspiration for the structure of my 8th book, Occupied City, and that was where I began with Akutagawa. And then soon after that, I bought Kappa, and that had a fantastically detailed introduction of about the life and times of Akutagawa. And I then just became, I just became quite an avid collector of as many different translations of Akutagawa's work as I could find, because actually Akutagawa, I would argue, is the most widely translated, not always the best, not the translations are not always great, but he's certainly one of the most widely translated, if not the most widely translated author. In his own lifetime he was translated. The Japan Times ran translations of his stories while he was alive. And I think the first translation came out by Glenn Shaw, who Glenn Shaw actually knew Akutagawa personally, and translated some of his stories, like collected some of his stories, The Tales Grotesque and Curious, came out only a few years after his death. And I kept trying to find these different versions and translations of the stories. Prior to the J. Rubin collection, there was the Seiji Lippert collection, The Essential Akutagawa, which includes, if you can ever find it, includes a brilliant introduction by Borges. Borges was, the Argentinian writer Borges, was one of the first non-Japanese writers to champion Akutagawa. And actually, Damien mentioned Lu Xun. Lu Xun was the first person to translate Akutagawa into Chinese during Akutagawa's lifetime. So, but anyway, that's why, so back in '94, as soon as I got to Tokyo, it was one of the first books I ever bought. So it's a very long answer to your question.
Great. Often when writers come into Akutagawa, they tend to, the inner grove features very largely. And for example, I was just reading recently Haruki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore. And there's a very obvious homage to Akutagawa in that at the beginning. He describes this incident during the Second World War in which 16 boys go into a grove and they all fall unconscious. And then afterwards he takes his numerous talking heads being interviewed by the police and the military authorities, all giving their different accounts of it. And when you read it, you go, here comes his Akutagawa homage. By the time you got to Patient X, did you sort of want to avoid that sort of more obvious sort of Kurosawa route to Akutagawa? Were you striving to perhaps come at Akutagawa in a new way?
Well, I'd used that obvious Kurosawa thing already, so I couldn't. Could I use the exact structure of the Rashomon film as well by using a gate in Occupied City as well? I think how this story, can I don't tell how this book came about, is that was the time? So, for a very long time I'd been writing for my own pleasure stories based on Akutagawa's stories. One of the things I do every day is to, as well as writing my own fiction, I also then in the afternoon spend time practicing writing. Eventually, I should probably spend longer, but I spend time copying out, if there's when I'm reading other people's work, if there's work that I particularly admire, or a particular paragraph or page that I really think is genius, I copy it out by hand and then kind of deconstruct it. For example, if it's written in the first person, change it to the third person. If it's written in the past, change it into the present, and sort of change the adverbs. I deconstruct it to see how it works. And Akutagawa was one of the writers that I did this with a lot. And of course, it's different when you're using translated fiction, because also then you can bring in the different translations and compare and stuff. And I was then putting together kind of stories. And even so, more than 12 years ago, I had a manuscript, which at that time was called Patient 23, in homage to the name of the protagonist in Kappa. And I wasn't sure what to do with these stories, and I kind of had an idea roughly that one day I might put them together and make a kind of collection about Akutagawa. But actually what then happened was that on March the 11th, the tsunami and the earthquake happened. I was actually, I'd been in Japan from 1994 to 2009. From 2009 to 2011, I was back living in West Yorkshire. And on the day of the tsunami and the earthquake in 2011, I was in West Yorkshire watching this unfold on TV. A couple of months later, some of you may be familiar with Motoyuki Shibata, Professor Shibata, one of the most well-known translators of particularly like Philip Roth, Paul Auster and various American authors into Japanese. He contacted me to say that they were putting together an anthology of stories in order to raise money for the rebuilding of the libraries, some of the libraries that had been lost in Tohoku. And would I like to contribute a story? And the stories were based on responses to the earthquake. But because I had been, although I had family in Japan at the time, although I had been here, because I'd been here, I didn't really feel that I could, it was a difficult thing to know how to respond to this. But I thought then there was a way to do this by looking at Akutagawa's response. As you said, Akutagawa lived through the 1923 earthquake, which killed over 120,000 people and destroyed the city. And I wrote a story which was called After the Disaster, Before the Disaster, which is one of, in an expanded form, is one of the chapters there. And then the stories just kept coming one by one, and then gradually there was enough. I thought I kept doing them in between, doing things like Occupied City and Red or Dead, and I felt that really. I think, not to be too dramatic, but from what I tried to do is to summon the presence of the person or the time and place that I'm writing about. And actually, by doing the short stories, I was finding it increasingly difficult to lose Ryūnosuke. So I just thought I'd better finish it really.
Well, one of the themes
That's not answered your question either.
One of the themes of the book, and that is something very important with Ryūnosuke, is literary obsession, and that being so literally obsessed can ultimately destroy you and sometimes destroy the people around you. Just running back a bit from the piece you read out earlier, before Akutagawa starts to see his own doppelganger and find the borders between his fiction and the real world go. There's a nice chapter you have in there about Psyche in London, and Psyche was sort of Akutagawa's mentor for about a year, and I'll just explain the chapters. We're in London. It's quite interesting, which is Psyche encounters a figure who seems to be Jack the Ripper, and leads him back to his lodgings. And what was sort of intimated in this is that, tell me if I've misunderstood you here, but is that Jack the Ripper is sort of like Psyche's own doppelganger, because Psyche was himself so utterly obsessed and self-sacrificing about literature that he's prepared to move out of his comfortable lodgings. He's prepared. He will do anything to get his hands on books. He's left behind in Japan a wife and children. He's also left behind his best friend who was dying. And the symbol of this becomes a biscuit tin that at one point Psyche had written in his diary that to save money to get books, because he was so obsessed with it all, he would eat biscuits on a park bench. And when we follow this chapter, we actually discover that the place that the Jack the Ripper character has led Psyche back to is actually his previous boarding house. He's sort of like reverting back to himself, and you get this sense of, well, what would Psyche have been if he hadn't been this sort of maniacally literary obsessed figure? I hope I've mainly
I think that's a brilliant interpretation.
Understood that. And there's a nice thing at the end of it where he passes the biscuit tin on to Akutagawa, and he says, "Here you go. Now it's your turn. You carry on with that." Is that? Do you recognise within yourself that are you somebody literally obsessed, and do you feel that has had a sort of you've had to sacrifice yourself in some way, or it's had a sort of destructive, there's destructive elements in that?
Well, you'd be better to ask the people, I suppose. I don't. I think though I'm drawn to writing. Who'd have thought we'd be talking about Bill Shankly and Ryūnosuke Akutagawa? But the novel I wrote before this was about Bill Shankly, the manager of Liverpool Football Club. And then obviously to go from writing about Bill Shankly to writing about Ryūnosuke Akutagawa is it's quite a leap. But actually the thing that they have in common, I would say, is obsession. And I'm drawn to people who are obsessed with what they do, because to be honest, like, if you're not obsessed and you don't care, you know, I think particularly anybody here who's, you know, anybody who is involved in like art or any job that they care passionately about, it does demand obsession if you are going to do it well, I would say.
And linked in, I guess, with obsession is rivalry. And this was a big thing that was going on at the time. I'm almost tempted to ask you whether you suffer from this. I was wondering whether you had a voodoo doll of David Mitchell at home and occasionally put things into it.
I've already agreed not to mention it. No, he's a great joke. You see, we're not at all, we're really good friends. You know, it's really disappointing. I'd like to say that, you know, we plot each other's demise, but he's a great friend and has been a champion of his book. You know, he's great. I don't have that. I have many here. You know, I have many here. I mean, I've been very fortunate that the writers I've met, people I've admired, like James Elroy or Ian Rankin, and people. They've been very kind and supportive, and I've learned a lot from them. So I don't feel that. I understand. What I understood there in that passage was very much that, like, Ryūnosuke's feeling that, you know, Ryūnosuke was obsessed for some time with Edgar Allan Poe, and I mean, there are days when, you know, I think the phrase is the anxiety of influence, when you can just be crushed by, you know, the other work is so good, you think, what is the point? And I feel that quite often.
Somebody asked me, I was giving a talk in northern Japan last year. This is setting the bar high now for the questions you've got to give, because somebody put their hand up and they said, why do you think it is that so many Japanese authors kill themselves? I thought, oh my goodness,
what did you say?
That's a tricky one, isn't
So
it?
what did you say?
Well, I think I gave some anodyne answer to it, but actually reading your book and thinking about it, I think in my own mind, I think I've kind of formed an answer, and I think the answer to, in my mind, am I allowed to say that?
Well, you might spoil the twist if people want to read
Is, well, no, this is my conclusion. I'm not necessarily saying it. Because I just think that literature in Japan in the 20th century is really a life and death business. It's something that people are putting everything into. It's not like, I mean, you don't have sort of figures like in Britain, like P.G. Wodehouse, who are sort of, you know, writing on the side, and it's all like fun, and, you know, they've got other things they're getting on with and stuff. It is absolutely, you know, everything. It absolutely monomaniacal about things. I don't know if you know, incidentally, but a lot of very iconic Japanese authors, as well as Akutagawa, like Osamu Dazai, Yukio Mishima, probably Yasunari Kawabata, all committed suicide. I wonder what you think about the question that Akutagawa killing himself on Tanizaki's birthday. What meaning would you ascribe to that? And I should just say that while I give you a minute to think about that. I've met recently an academic at some conference. I can't remember now, he was an expert on Akutagawa or Tanizaki. But I said to him, you know, what was going on with that? And he said to me, as I guess a very sort of Japanese way to answer this, he said, it was a mark of respect for Tanizaki. And I thought, well, I don't think so. I don't think that was the case. And I just wonder, earlier on in your book, you've got that description of General Nogi famously killing himself on the day of the Emperor Meiji's funeral. And again, this was sort of presented, but Nogi was a hero of the Russo-Japanese War, and he came up with the story that he had lived with the dishonour of losing his flag in the Seinan War of many decades earlier, and that finally, because the emperor had died, he felt that now he could follow the emperor in death. But there's something aggressive about that death that sort of steals the attention on the day when everyone's attention is on the Emperor Meiji and his funeral. Suddenly, everyone is switched to, oh my God, the General Nogi has killed himself. So there's something about the timing of death, the way you do it, that can be extremely aggressive and scene-stealing. And of course, as you know, Akutagawa's mentor, Soseki, one of his great masterpieces, Kokoro, touches on this very theme of how suicide can be manipulated, how doing through a sort of an aggressive suicide, you can sort of control the psychology, haunt the dreams of the people left behind for decades. And I just wonder, do you feel that there's any aspect of that with Akutagawa? Is there anything aggressive in his suicide?
I wouldn't say aggressive. No, I don't believe that he knew that it would. I actually think. I mean, one of the things I would say in the book is that I think I believe it. I mean, I was drawn. I mean, the mystery of his suicide. I think it was a big. I think every story, every novel essentially needs a mystery to drive it for me. Or I should say, no, sorry, that sounds so. Some sort of dictate. Every novel that I want to write, I feel there should be some mystery at the heart of it. And the mystery of his suicide was certainly one of the reasons that I wrote the book. But it's the end of it. I mean, I don't think that it was a conscious decision to end his life on the day of Tanizaki's, on the Tanizaki day, simply because he tried to commit suicide twice before. And I think that by the stage that he dies, I think that very tragically he actually didn't know. He was taking so much medication and sleeping pills that actually he didn't know if he was 90 or dead. Are we?
Yeah, sure. Final question then. But the many of the Japanese writers, like Mishima, for example, again, sort of obsessed with their literature and sort of find it hard to be tethered to their sense of existence, and look for some sort of solidity within such things as the pursuit of the body, or bodybuilding, or sunbathing, or things like that. I think Akutagawa seems to have been destabilised. I mean, he's already got quite a nervous, artistic disposition, but seems to be particularly destabilised by the earthquake. That the earthquake seems to shatter the sense of stability. And I think you're about to read about this. But just before you read that, how do you think that the earthquake affected Akutagawa?
I think the reason it's such a prominent part of the book is that I do think that he never really recovered. I mean, he made a trip to China in 1921, and he suffered great ill health during this trip. That was the only time he went abroad. And I don't think his health ever recovered from that. And I think that the devastation that he saw was, he never, apart from the last 6 months of his life when he enters his hugely prolific phase, when I think he knew that because he knew he was planning to die, and he had this huge prolific phase in 1927. But from 1923, after the earthquake, until 1927, the stories dry up. There are periods when he's not really producing any work at all, and I think it did have a huge effect. But I will read a little bit.
Please do.
And then we're going to take some questions, so you've got time to think of a question while I read that. After the disaster on the way back to Tabata, passing through Iria under a tangle of scorched electric lines beside streetcars burnt in their tracks, Ryūnosuke suddenly heard the voice of a child by the side of the road, the child playing in the rubble, the child singing My Old Kentucky Home. In a trice, the song of this child overcame the spirit of negation which had gripped and overwhelmed Ryūnosuke. Yes, thought Ryūnosuke, there will always be those who say that art is excess and surplus to our existence, and it is true. When your head is on fire, you do not think how best to represent the flames, just as when you take a piss or have a shit, maybe you don't think of Rembrandt or Goethe. Yet surely what makes humans human is always this excess and this surplus we create, which gives us our dignity, which helps us to transcend and to sing a song no quake or fire can ever destroy. But then, approaching Nippori, Ryūnosuke fell in step with a policeman. As the two men walked, Ryūnosuke questioned the policeman at length about the earthquake, about the fires, and about the various rumours of crimes and insurrection that seemed to still fall from every passing mouth, hanging in the air with the smoke and the odour of death, that stench of rotting apricots. The policeman, impressed perhaps by Ryūnosuke's helmet, was talkative but confessed while he knew many had been accused of malicious or revolutionary acts, he himself had seen no evidence of any such deeds. Just outside Nippori station, Ryūnosuke and the policeman came across the body of a man tied to a pole, his head beaten in, his body horribly mutilated, with a sign around his neck which declared he was both a Korean and an arsonist. The man must have died by inches, and even now, perhaps hours after his slow death, as Ryūnosuke and the policeman stood before him, another passerby approached to whack the corpse with a rolled-up parasol. The passerby now turned to Ryūnosuke and the policeman. He thanked them for their good work, bowed, and then sauntered off, swinging his now bloody parasol as he went. The policeman shook his head. He urged Ryūnosuke to take care, bade him farewell, and then walked on. After the disaster in the twilight, Ryūnosuke remained transfixed before the body of the Korean, the ground beneath him still rising and falling, and as Ryūnosuke stared at the body of the Korean, at all the bodies of the dead, as he stared across this city of rubble, across this city of smoke, everywhere he saw gears and wheels translucent against the earth, luminance against the sky, turning and spinning, grinding and screaming. Now 4 crows landed on 2 adjacent tilted twisted poles. They stared first at the corpse, then at Ryūnosuke. Ryūnosuke took off his helmet. Ryūnosuke bowed his head. The biggest crow lifted its bloody beak heavenwards and cawed once, twice, a 3rd time, and then a 4th. After the disaster, the official record stated that the Great Kanto earthquake had had a magnitude of 7.9 on the Richter scale, but it had started at 11:58 a.m. on Saturday the 1st, 1923, and had stopped after 4 minutes. Ryūnosuke did not believe the official record. Ryūnosuke believed the earthquake had not stopped, would never stop. Ryūnosuke knew the disaster was still to come.